During the Second World War, one of the simplest and most repeated execution methods was also one of the most brutal: pole hanging. It was used in cities, concentration camps, small towns and courts. Unlike other systems, this one required no special preparation. With just a rope, a tall support and an order, anyone could be executed in minutes. It was applied by soldiers, civilians, authorities, neighbors and even prisoners with power. The pole was not a symbol, it was a tool. In every corner of the conflict, from beginning to end, the hanging rope was a constant image. Why, among so many execution methods, was the pole the most used, the most feared, and the most repeated during and after the war? Pole hanging was one of the cruelest forms of killing used at the end of the Second World War. In May of 1945, after 6 years of brutal war, Europe was in pieces. Cities were in ruins, concentration camps had just been liberated, and justice became an urgency. Those who had caused so much horror had to be punished, but the big question was how to do it. What kind of death did the worst criminals of that time deserve? While Nazi leaders were being judged under international surveillance in Nuremberg, a very different form of applying the maximum penalty appeared in Eastern Europe: pole hanging. It was applied mainly in countries like Czechoslovakia and Hungary, between 1945 and 1947, and it was not only used for execution, but also to make death hurt more. Unlike classic hanging with a trapdoor, which causes a quick death by breaking the neck, this system was more basic, but also more merciless. A wooden pole about 3 meters high was used. The person to be executed was brought with their hands tied behind their back and their feet firmly secured. A rope was placed around their neck, which passed over the top of the pole, and the executioner held the end. The condemned person was lifted slightly from the floor and then released. The rope slowly tightened around their neck without breaking anything, just cutting off the air little by little. This agony could last between 1 and 5 minutes. All that time, the person was conscious, with a purple face, swollen eyes, struggling to keep breathing. This punishment was not invented after the war. It already existed since the times of the Austro-Hungarian army, where it was used to execute those who escaped or betrayed. What changed is that after the liberation, it was used again, but with a clearer idea: to make a public example of those responsible for the Nazi massacres and those who helped them. Between 1945 and 1947, pole hanging became something that everyone could see in squares or inside prisons. In Prague, the courtyard of the Pankrak prison was one of the most used settings. In Budapest, they did it in front of the music academy. They didn't hide it. Unlike what happened in Nuremberg, where deaths were private, here everything was open. Thousands of people went to see Karl Hermann Frank, who had ordered the destruction of the town of Lidice, killed. In Hungary, everyone saw Ferenc Szalasi, head of the fascist Arrow Cross Party, slowly suffocate, hanging from a pole. The authorities allowed photographers and cameramen to enter. They wanted it to be recorded forever. It was no coincidence that they chose that punishment. The governments of Czechoslovakia and Hungary said that those who had slowly killed thousands of people did not deserve a quick death. In Hungary, there was also a stronger reason. Szalasi's party had murdered thousands of Jews by throwing them into the Danube tied together so they would drown. The pole hanging imitated that suffering, slow suffocation in front of everyone. Many times, those who were going to die were forced to wear the uniform with which they had committed their crimes. Karl Hermann Frank was hanged in his old SS uniform, Szalasi in his party's green shirt. It was a final humiliation, a way to remember who they were and what they had done. Those in charge of executing were not improvised or volunteers with a thirst for revenge. They were experienced executioners. They had perfected their technique for years. Some knew how to manage the tension of the rope to make death faster or slower, depending on what was requested. The entire act followed a protocol. The condemned person was led to the pole by armed guards. A priest approached if the person wanted to receive the last prayers. The executioner, in a dark suit and hat, was in charge of tying everything securely. What the condemned person had done was read aloud. If the condemned person wanted to say something, they were allowed to. Sometimes they shouted fascist phrases. Then the punishment was carried out. The people watching reacted in very different ways. In some executions, everyone remained silent, as if it were a ritual. In others, shouts of support were heard when the dead person was someone very hated, like Andras Kuhn, the murderous priest. For some who had lost relatives in the Holocaust, these public deaths were a way to close a wound. Others thought that continuing to kill only fed more hatred. The journalists who were present left strong testimonies. A British one who saw Kurt Daluege die in Prague said that the death was so slow that it seemed designed for the condemned person to remember each victim. A Hungarian chronicler who saw Szalasi die wrote that no one applauded, no one celebrated. It was as if an entire country exhaled after years of fear. Pole hanging was not just a way to kill, it was a declaration. In Germany, under Allied control, methods considered more civilized were used, but the countries that had suffered Nazi occupation wanted to make it clear that they were now in charge and could punish as they wished. For the communist governments that were gaining power in that part of Europe, these public deaths also served to send their message. Communism had defeated fascism, and it had to be made clear who were the good guys and who were the bad guys. However, this form of execution didn't last long. By the end of 1947, most of the Nazi leaders were already dead. The new governments began to use less visible methods. The Cold War had already begun, and the public executions of fascists were replaced by more discreet trials against enemies of the system. Over time, almost all European countries abandoned the death penalty. It was a change that took decades and showed a different way of viewing justice. Hungary abolished capital punishment in 1990 after the fall of the communist regime. Czechoslovakia, which later split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, eliminated it in 1990 and 1993. The black and white photos of these executions remain as a testament to that time. Men hanging from poles, surrounded by people watching silently. These are images that show how justice and revenge intertwined when Europe was still full of open wounds. Those men who died on the pole were not common thieves. They were people who had organized massacres, sent thousands to extermination camps, or tortured relentlessly. Their lives show how ordinary people can become perpetrators of horrors beyond all logic. After the end of the war, pole punishment continued in several occupied zones, not only as a method of execution, but as a visible reminder. In many regions that had been under Nazi rule, especially in the East, this system continued to be applied during the first years of the new order. The authorities wanted everyone to know what happened to those who had collaborated with the enemy, or to those who now opposed the new power. The pole did not require special preparation. It was enough to find a high place, such as a thick branch, a wooden structure, or an iron bar. In small towns, even light poles or old warehouse beams were used. The only important thing was that it was visible to everyone. The chosen location was part of the message: a central square, a busy street, or in front of a public building. No one could pretend they hadn't seen it. Strong ropes were used, and the process was simple. The rope was placed around the neck, tightened by pulling from the other end, and the hanged person was left without touching the ground. It was slow, visible, and effective. There were no trapdoors or special mechanisms. Only the strength of the executioner, and the rope tightening more with each second. The face of the dying person was at eye level with everyone. There was no way not to meet their gaze. In these acts, speed was not sought. The choking lasted as long as necessary for those present to understand. Sometimes it was 3 or 5 minutes during which the body thrashed. The silence of the people made the scene even heavier. Faces turned red, eyes bulged, tongues hung out. Fear was spread without a word. Those who watched could not turn away. Many times, neighbors, workers, or even the condemned person's relatives were forced to be present. They could not turn around or look at the ground. Some covered their mouths to avoid screaming. Others did not blink. It was a punishment that did not end with death. The image remained etched for years. The signs on the chest were part of the ritual. The reason for the execution was written in large letters: traitor, spy, saboteur. Although in many cases these accusations had not been proven, a signed order, a denunciation, or a simple rumor was enough. The speed with which the sentence was applied left no room for defense. In prisons, the pole was also used, though within walls. The courtyard became the stage. Prisoners were forced to form a line still in front of the rope. The executed person was named, their supposed crimes were read to them, and they were hanged. Everyone had to watch. No one could speak. No one could cry. This method was also applied to control those who still wore uniforms. In the chaos of the final days, many soldiers fled, broke ranks, or disobeyed. Commanders caught them and, without formal process, hanged them in front of others. It didn't matter if it was a recruit or an officer. The important thing was to show that no one could leave without permission. In several cases, the very comrades had to prepare the pole. One group held the condemned, another held the rope. Some cried while carrying out orders. They knew that refusing could cost them their lives. One was executed, but everyone was disciplined. It was a tool of total control. The archives show pole executions in markets, train stations, factory yards, and even in front of schools. Multiple hangings were recorded, sometimes 2, 3, or 5 people at the same time. It was a brutal scene. The bodies hanging side by side, the wind moving them slightly, and the people observing in silence. Fear multiplied. Each public death caused a chain of silence. Families didn't speak, neighbors didn't ask. People lived knowing that any gesture could be interpreted as sympathy for the hanged person, and that could end the same way. Photos from that era show bodies hanging in ordinary clothes, pants, shirts, dresses. Some still with a bag over their heads, others with their faces uncovered. Sometimes blood was seen on their noses or mouths. The ropes marked the skin. The rigidity of the body indicated that there was nothing left inside. The punishment was repeated so often that in some villages it became part of the landscape. It was no longer surprising. People passed by, glanced sideways, and continued on. The dead were counted as time is counted. One more, another one, until it stopped seeming strange. Even children came to see these scenes. They walked hand in hand with their parents or ran nearby when the pole was being set up. They asked what was happening. Sometimes no one answered, sometimes they lied to protect them. But the image remained etched. A body hanging, a rope that doesn't let go, and a speechless crowd. Records show that authorities didn't always remove the bodies quickly. They were left there for 1 or 2 days. The smell sometimes mixed with that of the market. Birds approached. The clothes got wet in the rain. It was part of the message. This is what happens if you stray from the path. Oral testimonies confirm that many of those bodies disappeared without a trace. Some went to mass graves. Others were burned without identification. There was no ceremony, no name, no cross. Only the empty space where a life had hung. This type of death also crossed borders. Although the pole was used more in Eastern Europe, there is also data on similar executions in other places. In rural areas of Germany, for example, rapid rope punishments were applied in the first days of Allied occupation. Soviet troops also used this system against enemies of the regime. Some witnesses recall seeing poles set up in the middle of the street, with soldiers guarding them. The difference was that no public was allowed there, only the threat hung in the air. The use of the pole as an official method gradually disappeared. As trials became institutionalized and governments sought to show order, it became less common. Firing squads or imprisonment were preferred. But during those years, no one doubted its effect. It was cheap, direct, and remembered. No explanation was needed. The body spoke for itself. The rope was law, and the pole, the sign that there was no margin for error. Each public execution reinforced control. It was a combination of justice, punishment, and fear that marked generations. In prisoner camps, the pole was not a rarity. It was part of the system. There, no permission, no paperwork, and not much excuse was needed. If an inmate broke the rules or was simply singled out by an officer, the rope was prepared. It was as simple as giving an order and setting the scene. The guards gathered everyone in the courtyard, formed lines, and made them stand while the accused climbed onto the box. No one spoke. No one moved. The rope was adjusted, and gravity did the rest. The person hanging didn't scream much. Sometimes they didn't even get to protest. They just remained suspended while the others watched without blinking. These executions served to let everyone know that there were no second chances. If someone thought of escaping, hiding food, or simply refusing an order, they had before them the image of what could happen to them. Not much explanation was needed. Seeing it was enough. In many cases, other prisoners were forced to prepare everything. Some had to carry the rope, others set up the pole, and others directly push the person who was going to die. They did it unwillingly, with fear, knowing that if they said no, they would end up the same way. The system used the inmates themselves to apply the punishment. The custom became so common that some knew when an execution was coming by the footsteps, the prior shouts, or the way the guards stood. It no longer surprised them. They just bowed their heads and waited for it to pass. Afterward, another day just like the previous one. The bodies were not removed immediately. Sometimes they remained hanging all day. Other times they were left overnight. In the camp there was a sour smell, a mixture of dampness, fear and lifeless bodies. Birds sometimes pecked at the clothes. No one scared them away. The signs remained present. There was always one hanging from the neck or nailed to the chest. Saboteur, traitor, deserter. Although many could not read, the symbol was clear. A rope, a still body, and a sign with large letters. That was the education given in that place. In larger camps, such as forced labor or industrial camps, hangings were also used to discipline workers. If someone broke a tool, spoke when they shouldn't, or fell behind on a task, they could end up hanging, sometimes without proof, sometimes for revenge from a superior. The workers were lined up in rows. They were told to look straight ahead. The condemned person was placed in the middle and the signal was given. The rope did its work. Afterward, everyone returned to their places. No comments, no questions. The message hung between the sound of metals and quick footsteps. The scene repeated so often that some inmates dreamed of the pole. They dreamed that they were the ones climbing. They woke up sweating with the sound of the wind in their ears. Others no longer dreamed at all. They just went, saw, and remained alive. For one more day. In many reports recovered after the war, detailed descriptions of these executions appear. Some documents spoke of days with 3 or 4 hanged. Others mentioned the resistance of the ropes, the improvised poles, or the places where it was repeated more often. The camp authorities did not hide what they were doing. On the contrary, they used it to teach. Some officers even took new guards to see their first execution as part of their training. They explained how to properly secure the prisoner, how to tie the knot, and how to ensure they didn't escape. Punishments with a rope were so common that they no longer even needed reasons. In certain places, a misplaced glance, a misunderstood word, or an unfounded suspicion was enough. The fear was so strong that no one asked for explanations. Everyone assumed that the hanged person must have done something. Weather conditions did not matter. If it rained, it was done anyway. If it snowed, too. Even with strong winds, prisoners were forced to watch. Sometimes hoods were used, other times not. Some died immediately, others took longer. The result was always the same, a taut rope and a body that stopped moving. Women also suffered this type of death. In some mixed camps or rural areas, women accused of collaborating, stealing food, or simply for having spoken with a soldier were hanged. The procedure was the same. The rope did not distinguish. In these cases, the townspeople often came to watch. Some were forced, others were curious. There were no applause, no shouts, only silence. The body of a woman swaying gently as everyone looked down. Photos of those moments show simple clothes, loose hair, closed eyes. Sometimes tied hands are seen, other times not. But the expression on the face is always the same, a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and resignation. After the hanging, the body remained under surveillance. Sometimes a soldier stood nearby. Other times a sign was simply placed so that no one would approach. Hours passed until someone took it down, and almost never was it reported what they did with it. Relatives received no news, not a notice, not a letter, not a place to leave flowers. They only knew they would not see them again. Some asked. There was almost never an answer. Others cried in silence. In many towns, crying loudly was also dangerous. This method was recorded at different times during the war and in multiple territories. It was applied in camps, in towns, in occupied cities, and even in remote areas where there were almost no authorities. The rope was portable. Fear was too. Soldiers knew that hanging someone sent a stronger message than shooting. That's why they preferred it when they wanted to control many with a single act. They used it as a warning, as a lesson. No need to talk. Just watch. The pole became the center of punishment. People began to fear the place more than the reason. In some cases they avoided passing by. In others they acted as if it didn't exist. But everyone knew what could happen if they arrived at that place at the wrong time. The memory of those hangings lived on long afterward. Years later, people still spoke in hushed tones of the days when a body hung suspended on the town corner, of how the rope was heard creaking, of the steps that dragged the condemned. And although governments changed over time, the memory of the pole was not erased. It remained as a symbol of unrestrained power, of what happened when rules were applied with a rope in hand and no room for defense. In the last months of the war, when everything began to fall apart, the pole was still ready. It was no longer just about instilling fear. Now it was a desperate attempt to maintain some order. Executions became more frequent, faster, and often more chaotic. Any suspect could end up with a rope around their neck. If someone fled, if they argued, if they stepped out of line, it was enough. There was no review, no lengthy interrogation, just a signal from the one in control, and the punishment began. The places for hanging remained improvised. In the absence of solid structures, trees, gates, light poles, or beams from ruined buildings were used. The important thing was that it could be seen from afar. Even if the city was half destroyed, the hanging was carried out anyway. There was no longer time to gather crowds, but those nearby were forced to witness it. Some were brought from nearby houses, others were already there. They stood in line in silence, watching. No one spoke. No one asked for it to stop. Younger soldiers were also victims. If one abandoned their post or lost contact with their unit, they could end up hanged. The fear no longer came only from enemies, but also from their own side. No one knew if that morning they would return to their bed or end up as an example. In those days, bodies were not removed so quickly. Many remained hanging while everything around continued to burn. The war advanced, but the rope remained. Amidst the bombings, patrols still organized executions. There was no pause. The speed with which decisions were made was brutal. Someone gave a name, and minutes later there was already a sentence. Data wasn't even reviewed. If orders arrived, they were executed. Even if it was later discovered to be a mistake, there was no turning back. There are records of civilians hanged at church entrances, in front of stations, or in front of what remained of town halls, sometimes for unproven accusations, other times out of pure confusion. But the body remained there, with a sign nailed to its chest, and no one dared to ask. Photos from those days show more disordered scenes. Some bodies in torn clothes, hanging in the middle of ruined streets. There was not as much order as before, but the message was just as clear. They continued to show who held the rope and who should remain silent. Even as fronts broke and allies entered occupied cities, there were last-minute executions. Cases of hangings carried out hours before foreign troops arrived have been counted, as if even in defeat the pole had to have the last word. Sometimes the body was found hanging alone with no one guarding it. There was no one left to explain why it was there, but it remained hanging, motionless, in silence. A witness that until the very end, fear continued to be used as punishment. In some remote regions where news arrived late, executions by hanging continued even after the official surrender. Those who still believed they had power used it unrestrained. The rope was the only thing that had not surrendered. Orders from high command were no longer followed. Each group decided on its own. If they saw someone suspicious, if they thought they were collaborating with the new leaders, they would hang them, without warning, without a clear reason. Only the pole and the rope remained. The neighbors knew it. They knew that even with the declared end, the danger persisted. They lowered their heads, closed their windows, and tried not to look, but the smell returned, and the image of the swaying body also. In some towns, official records never noted these deaths. There was no record, no legal burial, only an empty rope the next day, and someone missing from the table. After the war, the remains began to be collected. Some were buried by aid groups, others by neighbors who could no longer bear to see more. But many remained nameless, without a story, without anyone to ask about them. The occupation authorities documented several cases. They found photos, partial reports, and testimonies from those who saw or survived these scenes. But the exact number was never known. Thousands are spoken of, but there is no definitive figure. The pole had been a tool of control, and when everything fell apart, it was the last thing to be let go. That is why its presence continued even after the regime fell. It took a long time to disappear from the routine. Years later, investigations were conducted. Facts were reconstructed, those responsible were sought, and an attempt was made to understand how something so simple had been so effective. But it was not about technique nor logic, it was fear, and the rope transmitted it without speaking. The pole remained in the memory of many, not as an object, but as a memory as that place where someone stopped breathing, where no one spoke, where everyone understood without anything being said. Those who were there did not forget it, not for what they heard, but for what they saw, because looking was mandatory, because not looking was also dangerous. Over time, some poles were torn down. Others were left where they were as a sign of what happened. In certain places, plaques were placed, in others, not even that. Only silence remained. The stories were told in hushed tones. It was said who was hanged, who pushed, who watched, but it was not shouted, it was not written down. It was something that was known but not shared. Years passed, and the new generations heard those stories from their grandparents. Some did not believe it, others did not want to know more, but everyone knew it was true, that it had happened. The archives showed more than 100 stories. They showed photos, papers, diagrams, some with stamps, others with erased names. But the method was the same: a rope, a high place, and someone who stopped moving. In many areas, the pole became a symbol that no one wanted to name. No flowers were placed, no homage was spoken of. It was just a hollow that remained there, even if it no longer had a rope. The ones who survived the fear of the pole told what they had seen, not as heroes, but as witnesses, ordinary people who saw how life could be cut short in seconds, without warning, without a chance to say anything. Today, those stories appear in documentaries, in books, in interviews, but they still have that tone of someone who speaks without raising their voice, because the echo of that rope, though unseen, is still felt. And so, the pole, which began as an occasional punishment, ended up being one of the crudest methods of that entire era, because it didn't need a machine or gunshots or much organization. It just needed everyone to look and to understand.